everyone. I'd like to introduce Dr. Christopher Hill from MIT.
Hi.
And I'd like to thank both RUPAC and SGI for inviting Dr. Hill, who's been running on the 100,000 cause at NASA Ames.
We do, yeah, occasionally. Yeah. It's true.
So, Dr. Hill, it's all yours.
Okay, well, thanks, and thanks for everybody for being here. It's good to be here. RUPAC contacted me to talk somewhat about some of the ocean work we do. So I study the ocean on large computers, I work in the Department of Earth, Atmospheric and Planetary Sciences at MIT. I heard some cats at MIT around research computing. We kind of gave up calling it HPC a while ago because everybody got confused about big data and HPC and things, so we just call it research computing. But I also lead an effort called MIT GCM, which is a ocean modeling effort that's been going for about 20 years. And I'm going to talk about some of the sorts of science that people do with that on large computers. Is the timer meant to be on, or is it? Sorry.
Yeah, but it's not here.
Oh, that's good. Okay, so I'll just carry on. Yeah. I'll just carry on as long as I like. Yeah. Okay, so what I thought, I'd just kind of walk through some examples of things that people do. This modeling effort, it really does rely heavily on the sorts of technologies that people here help enable. There's about 20 to 30 publications a month that come out on this website that you can see that we link to just to show sort of what's going on with it. And I just pulled down a few pictures from things that are there for the last couple of months just to kind of illustrate the sorts of things that people get up to, and then I'll talk a bit more specifically about some examples. But here's a picture of showing some measure of ocean circulation in the Arctic from a colleague, Gail Forget, who's taking satellite data and trying to do kind of giant brain scans on the whole planet and estimating its circulation. Another example here, colleague Ed Hill, who's measuring sound speed in the ocean, and this has to do with monitoring the interior state of the Pacific. But again, this is using some output from very large computations of ocean simulations. Another colleague, Oliver Yarn, has been looking at how biological processes in the ocean, how the biology in the ocean fixes carbon from the ocean, which is dissolved in the atmosphere. And this is a study that was used, again, a big modeling study that was used to explain some results from an interesting ocean cruise that a French group did, where they went around the world in a nice yacht around kind of the equatorial band, measuring things. Got it all sponsored by some rich benefactor, but they measured a lot of genomic data around that globe, and we used some modeling work to explain some of that genomic data. Another example here is Ewan Callis, who's just someone who just defended his PhD. Using, again, very large-scale computing to look at how the ocean draws down heat in the winter or the summer and understand some of the dynamics there. So there's a lot of fundamental things about how the ocean works that we don't understand, and that we don't understand well, and that modeling really helps us get our heads around. This is someone in the UK, Emma Boland, who is looking at this is South America and Antarctica here, and there have been a series of research cruises that have gone out and put dyes in the ocean in this region. They put in sulfur hexafluoride, which is an inert thing, and measure where it goes and how it dissolves, how it mixes into the ocean. And there's a lot of modeling work that goes on with that. And then another example of some recent modeling work is in the more applied area. This is a group in Canada that's been looking at off the coast of the Canadian Arctic and actually off Greenland here, what sort of consequences you might have if you have an oil spill up there. So, we're starting to see oil companies buying bits of land up in the ocean off Greenland and places, and everybody's obviously worried about what that could lead to environmentally. But just to step back, I'm going to first say a bit about where we come from in terms of studying the ocean. So the ocean, it's about 70% of the Earth's surface. It has, order one effects on the environment, so air-sea heat exchange and heat transport, so it's much warmer towards the poles on the Earth because the ocean and the atmosphere transfer heat from the equator towards the poles. Otherwise, the Earth will be a lot colder as you go further north than it is. There's significant moisture obviously content exchange between the ocean and the atmosphere. So if you look down from space, you see clouds over the ocean. Here's a nice view of the Pacific. You don't see much in terms of ocean dynamics because the ocean is actually very hard to see inside of. And so a lot of modeling work actually relates to trying to understand ocean dynamics or biology and so on in a way that is harder to see from space or in situ, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. Other things, the ocean is plays a central role in the overall carbon balance of the planet, so there's significant exchanges, both outgassing and drawdown of carbon dioxide in different regions of the ocean, and a lot of modeling work goes on to study how that process works and get better understanding of that. The ocean fixes about a third of the emissions that are surplus coming out of human activity relative to the kind of natural cycle, and then about a third is probably going to land, and then the rest sort of sits in the atmosphere. So understanding the carbon cycle is very important, and we do a lot of that. And of course, without an ocean, there wouldn't be us. So, a lot of life we think started from the ocean. So, we care about the ocean for many reasons. Okay. Observations are kind of partial and sparse, and so modeling is really one way to fill in the gaps, test our ideas about how the ocean works. So, just want to say a bit about what we can observe, and then show how we use some models to kind of fill in gaps. So, there's a lot of cool observations out there these days. Again, kind of leveraging the sort of data technologies and things that all get fed into these sort of data archives we've been hearing about and so on. So one cool thing that's only been going since about 2006 is this thing called the Argo network. There's a bunch of autonomous floats that move around the ocean, measuring every 10 days kind of the vertical column integrated properties of the ocean. And so you can see all these dots are actual Argo floats. This is where they were in September, I think, 2 days ago, I think. Oh, at least that's what they put on the map. And so these return stuff back to land, and then you can try and make sense of those. But if you are interested, now if I zoom down a bit, this is the coast of Massachusetts, where I come from, where there's a bunch of in situ observing things. What you'll notice that, if you're interested in measuring this region with Argo floats, Argo basically probably has one float in this region at any one time, or less than that. But there are some moorings and things that give us real-time information off the coast. So Rutgers runs some autonomous vehicles that go off the New Jersey coast. Woods Hole Institute runs things off here and in California. There are other similar places and up in UW. And as somebody mentioned, one of the interesting things about the observing the ocean is, you've got nice high-tech equipment we can all design these days to measure it, but the ocean is kind of salty, so when you put it in the ocean, it's actually a hard thing to measure. Another way we observe the ocean is ships. We still use ships. So this is ship tracks showing things measured recently around Antarctica. This is the experiment I mentioned before, where they put a dye into the ocean here, and there where that red dot is, and then they go out on these ship cruises and look where it's spread over the subsequent about 2-year period, and that helps us kind of get a partial picture of what's going on. And then another interesting thing that we use a lot of in terms of observations is in various contexts is ocean drilling. So you can drill sediment cores down from the bottom of the ocean. Those tell you a lot about kind of the time history. So sediments fall to the bottom of the ocean over thousands back in time by drilling sediment cores. So, but all these things are very sparse. Remote sensing gives us better coverage. So we have things like satellite altimeters and gravity satellites that NASA flies, and also visible spectrum satellites. These, can give us good surface coverage, except so altimeters and gravity, they can see through clouds, but they have a very long, or relatively long, spatial wavelength. Visible spectrum these days with hyperspectral sensors, you can actually see remarkable things. So this is the Bering Sea, and these are, if you could zoom in on this, you see the very small filaments you can actually see in color. But half the time this region, there's either ice or there's clouds over it. This picture was up on the web a while ago, back in July, because there was no cloud here, and it was spectacular to see what was going on. But most of the time it's hard to see this. This is off the Greenland coast. You see these swirling patterns of ice being carried down the Greenland coast, which tell us something about the ocean circulation, but Again, it's hard to see below the surface, and just to give a sense of the detail you can get from the surface when and again, there's clouds here, Greenland here. So this is a photo that again made it got a lot of publicity because the clouds lifted and you could see all this. You can actually see down to immense detail, but you can't see kind of what's going on beneath there easily, and so that's where kind of some of our modeling work comes in. So I've got. If we zoom in on that, so that's the little Greenland thing I was just looking at. These are a couple of movies of what you can do in a modeling framework today to try and understand a bit more about what's going on in this region. So there's two movies here. One is looking down on the ocean, but you'll see it kind of turns over in a minute. Looking down at the surface of the ocean, and it shows, so these are fluid dynamic simulations of actually kind of large regions around Greenland and Iceland, but what it shows is water masses, kind of how they pour out of the Arctic. So this green surface is actually a particular kind of temperature and salinity class of water pouring out of the Arctic into the Atlantic, and it's an important piece of the climate problem to understand how this circulation works, and it's something that you can only get hints at looking from space. You can go out in ships and so on to measure aspects of it, but really you need some modeling work as well to try and get a full, complete picture of it. So, you see these dense blobs of water coming out of the Arctic, flowing down over what's called the Denmark shelf here and down into the deeper ocean. This is something actually in climate models is very hard to represent, and so there's a lot of studies done on this because it actually affects kind of when we're trying to understand the climate of the Earth and its interactions between the kind of subpolar and polar regions. These are important processes. And then this is a similar view of this region. This is at one particular level, so you're kind of at about this level in this kind of bit of the fluid, and you can see this is the cold water coming down here, this kind of looping around, and then it goes beneath the warmer layers here. And so all of this stuff, you cannot see this complexity easily by going out in a ship because you get small samples of it, or with moorings, and from space you can't see down inside the ocean. So one of the only ways to really get our heads around this is to use modeling as well. Okay. So high-res modeling in this context can explore the underlying dynamics both at the surface and the subsurface, and this is an example where we're using it to improve our understanding and estimates of how the Arctic is exchanging water with the Atlantic. So in general, then computer models provide one way to try and fill in observation gaps and see inside the ocean, and to reason about kind of implications of the theory we have for how the ocean works. And so we can think of that, we could have two kind of ways I like to think we use these things. One is qualitatively, where we use them visually to try and just get a sense as to what the planet's doing, and I'll come to those at the end because they're not as kind of quantitative. But then there's also how we do this quantitatively. So I'm going to just look at three things: some idealized studies, some work we do on kind of model data synthesis, and then a kind of blend of thinking in an idealized framework and thinking about actual model data synthesis where we're actually trying to estimate the state of the planet. So sort of idealized studies we do in kind of using very large scale computing are, one of them is illustrated here. So this is not the Earth as you know it. This is a different sort of Earth, okay? So this is an Earth that's covered in water except for two strips of land. But it has kind of something that is akin to a Gulf Stream against this kind of western boundary of a basin that keeps moving around there. It has a kind of something that's equivalent to the Pacific, although it's kind of more open and the bottom is all flat and so on. And it's a very useful tool actually for reasoning about some of the fluid dynamics of the planet in a essential framework. So if you want to think about how the basic equations of motion that we know for fluids actually play out in a complicated setup where these are equations we can write down, but we can't solve them analytically. And then we can use tools like this to set up idealized situations that we can then do analysis on to try and understand the dynamics that are going on. And one of the questions this has been very useful around is when you look from space at the propagation speed of certain features that you can't. So these are eddies in the ocean. They have a surface signature that you can see from space in the real world. The propagation speed doesn't quite fit our analytical models of what it should be, and there's an interaction essentially between kind of the mean currents and the wave speeds that you see in these sort of in a fluid, and simulations like this, which are pure virtual worlds using big computing, can help us try and tease out ways to explain the anomalies that you actually see in the real world observations. So this is one example of kind of how we do idealized studies, and we do a lot of sort of work like this that is highly idealized, but is aimed at explaining the real world around us. At the other end of the spectrum, then, we also do significant amount of work, which are what we call model data synthesis. So this is trying to take the contemporary observations of the planet, for the ocean in particular, so gravity satellites, sea surface altimeter height satellites, ship cruises, these Argo floats that I mentioned before, and people always like the seals. These days there's a program which goes out and attaches sensors to seals who go out and measure stuff opportunistically and can go places that actually machines that we make can't go, and then they transmit stuff back from their heads. And this is okay. They molt their skin or something every year, and apparently the seals don't mind, I'm told. But I don't know. Anyhow, but anyhow, you get all these streams of data coming in, and what we do a lot of is trying to recreate a three-dimensional, time-varying atlas, essentially, of what the planet has been doing over the last, say, 20 years. So it's only about 20 years that we've had this sort of wealth of data. Prior to that, we really didn't have enough data for this to be a viable exercise. And so we've been generating, and we do this a lot in conjunction with both NASA and the Department of Energy and NSF, a series of kind of online atlases that essentially evolve taking all the data streams that come from these devices, iteratively combining them with models, which we've been over time increasing the skill of as computational power allows, and as we get better ideas on algorithmically how to do this. In that iterative process, we try and bring the model into more consistency with the data. So when you set up a model, say, of the real world, there are certain things you're not sure about around the boundary conditions or how you represent certain physical processes. Some of those you can say, well, I've got an error bar on them. I can actually adjust that to make things fit to the data more. And we do this in a big iterative optimization process, which is kind of like, it's not so different to what goes on when you go and have like a brain scan or an MRI, except that we're doing this on the whole planet, and you're in a fluid situation with everything, is moving as well. The planet doesn't, or the ocean doesn't sit still while you do this. So, but what comes out of this is these atlases that allow us to say something about, how the ocean has been evolving over the last 20 years in an ongoing sense. So that is a useful piece of information for sorts of things we've been talking about around sea level rise and things, trying to figure out, what are the bounds we should put on that, and that's one of the uses these sort of calculations get put to. Another example we have, so other examples of how we use that then are we leverage these state estimates then for a number of derived studies. Okay, so a couple I've shown here. This is a study that took one of those state estimates and asked questions around, can we tease out how, so everybody I think is aware that the Arctic sea ice has tended to be shrinking over the last 20 years or so on. If you look at the aerial extent of Arctic sea ice from satellites, there's a downward trend that's been steady for a good 20 or so years. Obviously it has some oscillations, but on the whole it's a reduction in sea ice cover. On the other hand, in the Southern Ocean, actually there's some increase in cover, and understanding exactly what it is that's setting these behaviors is not easy. So Arctic sea ice cover is affected by the underlying ocean temperatures, the overlying atmospheric temperatures, and also the wind, and many other processes as well. And so one study we did here was to actually take one of those brain scan type reconstructions of the state of the planet and perturb the wind field to look at just what is the role of stronger or weaker wind circulation over the Arctic in actually sustaining the sea ice cover over that region. So in addition to thinking about warming, as I say, one of the other processes that affects ice cover is actually wind stress at the ocean surface. And what we find is, there's about a 15% change in, we're measuring actually Arctic freshwater storage here, but a lot of that it takes the form of ice. There was a 15% change by persistently setting the winds in one sort of pattern and one extreme pattern that happens versus another extreme pattern. This is kind of interesting because in the Southern Ocean, where the ice has been increasing, there's also been, where the ice has been increasing, and this is, always causes confusion in debates around how the climate is actually evolving. Sort of wind patterns are changing there, and the same sort of thinking can be applied in the Southern Ocean. So it's not just, when people talk about global warming and climate change and so on, these subtle dynamics are things we can use kind of large-scale computing to tease out a better understanding of why everything doesn't just kind of uniformly do one thing, why the message can be somewhat confusing for everybody. So so this is an example of sort of studies we do using some of those state estimates. Another example is this piece of work, which was actually developing a new approach to thinking about biology in the ocean. So I mentioned on the one of the earlier slides, so in addition to kind of the physical circulation of the ocean is full of living creatures, particularly phytoplankton and other small plant life type organisms that are microbial scale. So these are things that, sub-millimeter size, little unicellular organisms, but there's a huge mass of them. There's no, there are some things like the Sargasso Sea where there's, plant life looks more like plant life on land, but a lot of the plant life in the ocean is actually these marine microbes. And what was done in this study was experimenting with the idea that we can actually create, instead of, historically people have modeled these things by writing down a sort of prescriptive set of equations between different kind of like chemical species like concepts of microbes with rate exchanges between them. In this work we actually put together kind of virtual microbes that kind of represent classes of microbes that actually compete. We don't set the chemical rates between them, we let them actually compete. And this has sparked a new way of actually looking at kind of microbial modeling in the ocean. So, again, the sort of this has big computing demands, and it is, in some sense, it provides a new perspective. I nearly said better there, but that's you never want to say that about other people's methods. But it provides a new perspective on how biology works in the ocean. And we're learning a lot from that. It's driving a number of observational missions and so on. So, and then at the end, we also take the same models and work with stuff beyond the ocean. So there's a number of activities that NASA is leading at the moment to observe things in deep space. So the Kepler telescope, which was looking at exoplanets and transiting signals across remote stars, and then TESS is another mission to be launched soon. We can actually do kind of, and in the science world, people love doing this. They can do these hypothetical studies using similar technology to say, what sort of planets might look like that emit certain spectral signatures that are seen through Kepler and TESS. So this is branching out from the ocean, but it's actually the same sort of modeling technology. You can take things, and this is for what's called a hot Jupiter. So it's a very large planet going around close to its sun, which are the easiest things to see from current observing devices. So what I wanted to so those are some of the examples of sort of science that's being enabled by big computing, using kind of ocean models that are out there, particularly the one we have. But there are other ocean modeling activities. I want to say a tiny bit about from the ocean perspective, looking forward where the sort of role of the talk about Exascale is going and where we see it going. So the challenge in something like the ocean, and in many physical systems, is the system dynamics are coupled over many space and time scales. So this is a sketch that someone called Dudley Sheldon made of different processes in the ocean and their kind of spatial and temporal characteristic signature. So something that goes from 1 meter to 100 kilometer or 10 kilometers is kind of this blob here, and it's a process that lasts from a few hours to a few days. So it gives a kind of footprint on this diagram. Obviously, the ocean itself doesn't know about these separate processes. These are just abstractions we create, and they're all coupled together. At the moment, we can at the best do kind of like this gray area here, and we can kind of move this box around on what we can do, but it's hard to get across all the scales. I mean, in particular, there's a lot of interesting kind of boxing in the if you see, there's a kind of somewhat of a decoupling here between kind of wave dynamics that we know well down here and things that get more turbulent up here. We would like to kind of be able to box in all of that, and so there's some big opportunities as kind of things move forward in the exascale space to actually do calculations that do this and use those to they won't be feasible for actual kind of multiple experiments, but they can provide a framework, again, for a virtual experiment that you can actually diagnose much better than we can at the moment what the sort of connections are between these scales. So that's one activity that we're gearing up towards doing, some of those idealized experiments, but at a much more comprehensive set of physical scales. And then biogeochemistry in the ocean, I say, is very important. We have been driving forward these kind of marine microbiology models that use a much more kind of leverage, essentially, ideas that we know from life science and biology. There again, there's huge computational cost to these, but there's huge potential benefit to understanding the dynamics of the ocean. So, both of these are areas where, in the future, I think as technology grows, we'll be able to kind of drive more than that. And I'm almost out of time, so I would just say that, in terms of the HPC's perspectives, HPC practices, along with sort of advanced data analysis, are providing, enormous benefits to the research activities in ocean science. There's been enormous benefit from having a set of ocean open source general purpose modeling tools. There's a list of them here. That they really provide the glue between domain researchers to leverage some of the technology advances that are going on in the hardware side and at the kind of more computing-y level. Obviously there are many more examples that I haven't listed here. That there's really a very well-established ecosystem around this that is leveraging both sort of HPC, big data thinking, and also immense improvement in kind of observing technology over the last 20 years. So, there's huge potential going forward, I think, for the ocean community and in what's going on in this community. So, and then I guess we'll end with a few pretty movies, and anybody we can have some questions and comments while we do it. So these are all experiments that we've actually run on big computers, some at NASA Ames, some at NSF, and so on, but they just kind of capture some of the things you can't see when you look at the ocean, when you look out at your boat or whatever, but there's all sorts of cool things going on. So, any questions?
Questions, Dr. Hill? Bob?
Are there any new sensors out there that could significantly advance the
So I think, robotics and autonomy are going to, so yes, is the answer. I think it's still a very hostile environment, and so it's not as easy as, the Internet of Things around, land-based. But there's clearly that technology has a role to play here. But if you take, as I say, your Internet of Things, average Internet of Things sensor and put it in salt water, it doesn't work so well. So because, also sending information back is hard. You have to come to the surface and then transmit or whatever. But yeah, the Argo floats that I mentioned, that's one example. There's a lot of work on autonomous vehicles and how they, use energy efficiently and whatever, smart ways to do that. But I think, that will be pretty transformative.
Yes. Have you done any modeling on Gulf Stream changes?
I guess, implicitly, or in here, things like the Gulf Stream. And so people do look at that. The Gulf Stream is actually driven a lot by wind, actually. And actually one of the studies I mentioned, the one the studies involving water coming down from the Arctic, there is a possible relationship between kind of the density of the water that comes out of the Arctic, whether it's warm and salty or cold and fresh, and kind of how the path taken by the Gulf Stream, which can have climate fingerprints on it, but all of those studies have big error bars. We're not making particularly good at forecasting those things yet.
Hi, Steve Leginski. I wanted to know if you had any experience yet applying reduced order modeling to some of these large data sets in a way.
That is actually kind of where I think we will go with a lot of so this is what we're doing here. Essentially, the short answer is not as much as we'd like to, but what we have been working on lately is using numerical frameworks to generate, very highly resolved, very high order, high dimensionality data sets that then we can apply some of the kind of data analytics techniques to start developing reduced order models of various sorts. And so we are starting to do that. There's a group of aero-astro people at MIT who do that a lot. We're starting to collaborate with them. It's just the dimensionality of it is very different, but I think that is an area where, as the computing resources kind of grow over the next decade, it will put us in a position to actually resolve for certain scenarios some of the things that we want to kind of connect together, which will then lead us to a position where we can actually then use those as virtual test beds to actually derive simplified models that actually are more accurate than what we have at the moment. Obviously, there's a lot of theories out there on what those reduced order models should look like, but none of them work so well in practice. It's hard.
Any other questions? Dr. Hill, thank you.